This is Leave Your Mark. I'm Vince Cortese, and today's guest is Paul Sansini, a reporter, editor, and staff development director for the Milwuakee Journal for 37 years and a correspondent for the New York Times for 15. He also taught journalism courses and a musical theater history course at Marquette University. And Sansini is best known for his work with Broadway legend Stephen Sondheim and the Sondheim Review. Paul, thank you for being my guest here today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Hi there, and welcome. Now it's time for America's favorite podcast, Leave Your Mark, with your host, Vince Cortese.
If it's fly, loose fitted, it's Cortese. If freeze and chub is in it, it's Cortese.
Leave Your Mark is about inspiring the world, one guest at a time.
Pass the word from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, from urban to suburb, it's Cortese, you heard?
And here is our host, Vince Cortese.
I like your story from the standpoint that you're attracted to writing right away, and you went into formal writing with being a journalist, and journalists are all about telling the truth. But your story kind of blends over where you're attracted to the entertainment part and you end up writing fiction down the road. So I'll talk about that a little later. I want to introduce you to the audience and where you're born and raised and what life was like when you're a younger fella.
Okay.
So I have you here. You're born and raised in Hubble, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. You referenced it was brutal winters. I could just imagine that off of Lake Michigan. Your parents, Josephine, and your father, Luigi. Mom was a homemaker, and your dad worked in the copper mine. And you had 7 children in the family in total. You had 2 brothers, 3 sisters, and you had one of them pass away prior to your birth, and the youngest being 10 years younger than your oldest sibling. So a nice big family. Share with me a little bit about your childhood. You said that both your brothers went to the war. They joined the Navy in World War II, and you didn't really get to know them after. That was an interesting time in American culture. So could you just share a little bit with me about what you remember with that?
I remember the war. I was born in 1935, so I remember the war. I remember my mother taking part in the activities of homemaking activities for the war. I remember the food stamps, or whatever they were called, the rationing. And I remember VE Day very clearly. I remember the sirens going off in the town, and everybody was so excited that the war was over.
I'm sure that was for sure. Now, you go to Sacred Heart High School, where your interests are musical theater, journalism, movies, and hanging out with your friends. That's always a good one in high school. And then you go on to college after graduating. Your local school you took up for a couple years, and then a year off to work for a local paper. Share with me the name of that local paper. And it sounds like this is the beginning of your writing career.
It was called the Houghton Mining Gazette, because this is a whole mining area in Upper Michigan. And I started off as the staff was like about 5. And I started off as a reporter. And within a few months, I was named associate editor. And so I was running things, and I would barely know what I was doing. But the editor was really good, and he helped me along. And if it wasn't for him, I really don't know what I would have done to encourage my path toward journalism and a journalism a career.
That's exciting. You had a great first experience to something that you were attracted to like that. Now, how do you work in? Do you just work for that paper for a year and then you go back to Marquette University where you go for a journalism major? How did that transition happen?
I took a year off because I didn't have the money to go to Marquette. I needed to save up some money. So that's why I worked for a year at the Mining Gazette. And then I got a scholarship to Marquette. So I was there, finished my 2 years at Marquette, and took the required courses and worked on the campus paper and became editor of the campus paper.
You were off and running. So now you finish up at Marquette, and explain to me how the position with the Milwuakee Journal came to be.
Well, I always wanted to work at the Milwuakee Journal. It was the paper we got at home. And so I applied there, and I was lucky enough to get a job. I started in April of 1959.
Now, was that something that you just applied for, or did you know somebody in the Milwuakee Journal? How close was Milwaukee to your hometown, too?
It was a good paper. This was the glory days of journalism, and I was really lucky to get on. I didn't know anybody on the paper. I applied to the editor, and I was interviewed, and I got the job.
That's very exciting. So now you end up staying here for 37 years. So as a journalist, what was your initial position, and did you move up in this paper like you did with the local one when you first started?
I started off as a reporter. I covered the suburbs, actually. And then I moved to the state desk, which is the desk that handles the news from Wisconsin, well, around Wisconsin, including the Madison Bureau, which covered state government. And then the state editor retired, and I became state editor. And I was doing that for about 12 years, I think. And then I was offered the job of staff development director, which is really a terrific job. It was included being recruiting staff members, having charge of the internship program, putting out publications for the staff, doing training for the staff, and also being the writing coach for the staff, which was the best part of it because I worked individually with reporters on their stories.
Now, listening to your experience there, it sounds like a lot of what you got on the job was what you would end up going back and teaching at the college with the curriculum there going into your fiction. Is that true? They were referencing some of the research that you do, and you got pretty diverse training there. How long of a period of time did that take?
Well, I was at the paper for 37 years, and then there was a merger of the Milwaukie Journal and the Milwaukee Sentinel, the other paper in town. And so I took a buyout because I really wanted to do other things.
How much of when you were writing, being that the creative side of things and being into the musicals, did you how long till you actually scratched that itch there?
The musical theater itch?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was always interested in musical theater. I can remember when I was in 8th grade, I bought the record album of South Pacific, and it was amazing to me to be in this little town in Upper Michigan, and sometimes with being snowbound and being able to listen to Mary Martin and Ezio Pinza singing these wonderful songs from South Pacific. So I collected a lot of original cast albums. And when I went to move to Milwaukee, I started going to musicals and plays here in Milwaukee. And occasionally I would get to New York to see Broadway shows.
Let me ask you then, as a journalist, what was your favorite part of your work as a journalist?
My favorite part was being the writing coach, working with the other reporters on their stories. It wasn't that they really needed help. It was just that they were interested in getting help. And I was able to do that, able to maybe change a phrase, maybe change the lead, maybe change the organization of the story. And that was a very creative part of the work. And it was very satisfying.
Now, what's interesting is how you're framing the story, or as you're mentioning, you do. So, as far as a journalist, you're writing about, reality. So, what in your research or your experience with your work would you say changed your views in life?
Well, it was interesting, especially being the state editor, to be able to read the stories from what was coming out of Madison about state government, because at that point, state government was pretty clean in Wisconsin. I can't say that now, it was pretty, I wouldn't say clean. I think I would say not very disruptive. And it was the parties got along, they passed good legislation. The governor was working with them. And it taught me something about good government. And I compare that to what's happening now, and I'm afraid of what's happening now.
I'm sure it's changed so dramatically to where we currently stand.
Connect with us on LinkedIn. Be our friend on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram.
Whether jumping out the MP or jumping on the app.
You are listening to Vince Cortese. We just want you to leave your mark.
Now, at what point then did you write your first book?
Well, I wrote my first book. It was totally different from journalism. It was fiction. And the reason for that is, as you can tell from my name, I'm Italian American. My father was born in Italy, and my mother's parents were born in the same town. When my father came over to work in the copper mines in Upper Michigan, he stayed with this family that had 5 sons and a daughter. Well, of course, he and the daughter fell in love, and those are my parents. But they're both from the same town in in Tuscany, northwest of Lucca. And one time I went over to, I discovered that I had relatives there. And one time I went over there, and my cousin Fosca, who died last year at the age of 94, told me that during World War II, she and some other relatives had to flee to the hills because the Nazis had occupied their town. And so they stayed in a farmhouse way, way up in the hills for 3 months. And I thought that was such an interesting story that I wanted to write it, because here they were with the war going on around them. And then I discovered that there was a massacre nearby at Sant'Anna di Stazzema, in which 560 villagers were killed by the Nazis in 4 hours. Some of them were put in front of the church and set up on fire. It was a terrible, terrible massacre, the second worst in Italy during World War II. And so that was part of the story as well. And so I really wanted to write it as nonfiction, I should say. And then so I decided to write it as fiction. And I did a lot of research. I think I read about 60 books about the war, about the partisans, about the Nazis, about the Americans moving north in Italy during World War II. And it was very, very exciting. The result of that was a book called The Cielo, Cielo. And it won several awards. And the thing was that I had created a number of characters for that book, and they were still in my head when I finished it. And I wondered what they were doing. So I thought I'd write a sequel. So I wrote a sequel called Sparrow's Revenge, which was the name of a partisan. And so after that, the people were still in my head. So I thought a trilogy would be nice. So I wrote another book called Dino's Revenge, Dino's Story. It was set in Florence during the 1960s, and so I wrote a trilogy, and then they were still in my head. So I wrote a 4th book and a 5th book and a 6th book, and many of the same characters were in it, but that kept introducing new characters. But then I decided that that was enough. These people from the beginning were getting old, and it would be pretty sad if I wrote about them. So I ended the what I call the Tuscan series, 6 volumes. But I still wrote a couple of other books, collections of short stories, and I wrote 2 children's books. Also, they're all set in Tuscany, and I just loved there. I went there 13 times, and it was a wonderful experience.
It sounds like it. Now you have 10 books in total. So let me ask you this: the story you just shared was what inspired you to write a book. Now, how does a book, like, because you said you were going to go nonfiction and you ended up writing fiction, how do you put that together in your mind? And then what are your initial steps when you start writing?
Well, first of all, I need characters, and I need a setting, and I need a story. Most of all, I need a story. I had the story, of course, in the first book, because it was a story about people trying to survive during the war. In the second book, it was a story about a partisan taking revenge for that massacre that I've described. And the third story was set in Florence during the flood of Florence in 1966. And a boy who was just born in the first book and 10 years old in the second comes of age and during that flood. So that was that story. And then the other 3 books in that series were collections of short stories with the same characters doing their own things, but the stories were related.
How much of your journalism is influenced in your fiction writing?
I think an ability to observe, an ability to look for details, and an ability to interview, because all of these required interviews, an ability to do research, an ability to stand back from the story and not get involved in it.
Now, after you've written these books, when did you meet Mr. Stephen Sondheim?
Well, that's a totally different path, I guess I would say. I was always interested in musical theater, and I became interested in Stephen Sondheim's works in 1972 when I saw a show on Broadway called Follies. I didn't know anything about Sondheim at that point, but I was blown away by this show. The story was about a reunion of showgirls coming back to New York. And it was about 2 couples. The wife of one had always been in love with the husband of the other, but the husband was not reciprocating. But there was much more than that. It was a story about past and present, about the future and the past, about how people change, how people deceive themselves and others. In fact, in short, it was about the follies of our lives. Well, I became so obsessed, I guess you'd call it, with Sondheim's work that I started collecting things and books, and I read everything I could. I went to see his shows whenever I could. And I developed a connection with him, and I wrote him notes, and he'd reply because he was very good at replying. And this was in the 70s, I said. And I started thinking about, well, maybe I'll write a book about this, because there hadn't been a good book about him at that point.
Is the Sondheim Review, is that a book or is that a series of like short stories?
No, that's a magazine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in 1994, when I decided I could not write a book, I just did not. I decided, well, I'm a journalist. I will put out a magazine. And I found it, I can't believe I had that chutzpah in order to do this, because I wouldn't be able to do it now. I couldn't believe that I did it then. But I just decided, okay, I'm going to put out a quarterly magazine devoted to Sondheim's works. It would not be a fan magazine. It would be a journalistic magazine. We would have news, we would have interviews, we would have reports, and we would have various essays and everything. And so the first issue came out in summer of 1994. This is the first issue. And I'll show a couple of, this is another issue. And another. So during that time, I, of course, developed a relationship with Stephen Sondheim.
That's what I was going to ask you next. I'm sure with the forum that you created here in the magazine, he was thrilled, because it was more of an intellectual type look at his work than a review. Right. So
that's right. And at first he didn't know what it was. I think he thought it would be a fanzine, but it was not. And he realized when it came out that it was not. And so he was very concerned about it. And because there hadn't been any other magazine like this for a living composer. This was the first. And so he didn't know what to make of it. And so he took very careful, I think he read every word of every issue, and he was sitting down and maybe marking things up, and he'd write me notes or call me up and say, well, this little thing is wrong, or that little thing is wrong. And people complained that he was being too picky. And he wrote back and said, no, this magazine is going to be used by scholars, and I want everything right. And that's what he did. I mean, he made sure that every word was right. But during that whole time, we developed this relationship of him sending me information. Sometimes he'd give me news tips, and sometimes he would talk about his work. He would get on the phone. He was all during this period, he was writing a show, which was originally called Wise Guys, and then it became Gold, and then it became Bounce, and then finally it became Roadshow. It was the same story, but it changed dramatically over the years. And he would get on the phone and talk about the creative process and how he was changing things, how his book writer, John Weidman, was changing things, how they were taking songs out and adding new ones. It was so fascinating to me to listen to this, because it was listening to an artist creating a work. And that as a journalist, especially, I just enjoyed that so much, listening to that.
This is fascinating because he's a Broadway legend. You were attracted to music. So I want to ask you, with the books that you wrote, as well as this review, what was your favorite piece of work?
Of Sondheim's, or what?
Overall, which one? Because you wrote your move pretty much writing 6 books on the Tuscany and the story, but which one? Could you put your finger on one that was your favorite piece of work, or was it just collectively you just enjoyed doing it?
I think I just collectively I enjoyed doing. I think my first book, The Cello, was a favorite, mainly because it was my first book, and I think the story is really strong in it. But I also enjoyed putting out the Sondheim Review, and that was challenging. We had a small staff, and it was a kitchen table kind of thing. I was in Milwaukee and he was in New York, so it was a long distance relationship that we had.
It sounds like you would have enjoyed him, being that you in the journalism and the level of research, and you enjoyed teaching it. And then he is meticulous to the detail of your review. So how much of that did you appreciate, and how much did it bother you that he was that detailed, or did that thrill you?
As a journalist, I respected it. I respected his concern that everything was correct. And we had a good relationship throughout my career, my time as an editor of the Sondheim Review. There was only one time when he really got upset about something we'd published, and that was pretty unnerving.
Oh, that's interesting.
If you are listening from Australia, Florida, or just from around the corner,
From East Coast to West Coast outlets, if you're not into the dirty South straight, make a left and body.
contact us. Leave your mark with your host, Vince Cortese.
Now, what I would like to do is that you had a bunch of students over there in Milwaukee, and if you had a billboard for your students, what would it say?
What would it say? In journalism, as a journalist, just in general?
For your journalist students.
I think it would say, keep your eyes open, or something like that. Be open to everything. And this is a pretty big billboard. That there, just be open to all the things that are out there and learn from them, and don't close yourself off to ideas, and learn to think for yourself.
Now, a next question I have is, in your journalism career, what was the best compliment you ever received?
Oh, I don't know. I think it was from the reporters that I worked with as writing coach, and that they were so appreciative of how I helped them and improved on their stories.
And let me ask you then, as far as writing goes, what is your favorite part of the process?
The research. The writing is hard. Writing is really hard. But learning things in the research is fun, and you learn so much more than you're going to write about. But it's just opening yourself up to all kinds of things that are out there that you don't know about.
Now, you've had a full career, and do you have any next projects in mind that you'd like to do?
We haven't talked about my book, which I think your listeners, viewers would be interested in.
Okay, tell me about that.
Yeah, Sondheim died a year ago, November 26, 2021. And after that, I went through all the notes that he'd written to me, and I went through the magazines that I'd published, and I thought there's a book here. And so I wrote a book about the years that I had spent as editor of the Sondheim Review and my relationship with Sondheim. And I found a publisher, and it came out in October. And this is the book, Sondheim and Me.
I'll put the links in on the video for the people, the viewers, so they can have access to that. Is that on Amazon?
It's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and it's everywhere. Yeah. So anyway, and it's my publisher was really great, because it's not only the text, but he also has a 64-page insert.
Oh, wow.
Photos and everything
playbills
in the magazine. And there's also a 23-page chronology of Sondheim's life from birth until death.
Wow. So
it surprised me that he did that, but I have a very adventurous publisher, and that I think that lends a lot to the book, besides the text, which I think is interesting in itself.
This is exciting. So, are you promoting the book, or any book signings anywhere, anything like that we can watch for?
Yeah, I've been doing book signings. I've been doing interviews, television shows. I've got another television show tonight, and I've been writing pieces that have been published. And it's been quite an adventure in the last month.
Heading over to New York in the Broadway area to promote it, or have you done that already?
No, I'm sorry, I don't travel anymore.
Not anymore. Well, what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to ask you, as I asked all my guests, how would you like to be remembered? How would you like to leave your mark?
I'd like to be remembered, I think, as someone who was open to ideas, but also I encourage people to have a thread that goes through their life. My thread, well, I had several threads. One of them was musical theater. One of them was journalism. But it's just that if you have a thread going through your life, you can remember things, and you can have relationships during that time. I mean, it could be something like stamp collecting, or playing cards every week, or just being aware of people, and taking kids to ball games, something that you do as a habit and that you can remember doing and look forward to doing it again. That's not to say you shouldn't be making new friends or doing new things, but just that I think having something continual in one's life gives it stability, something to look forward to. And that's the way I've looked at life, by having threads in my life that have held firm for me. And I looking forward to having them forever.
How much did your writing influence your growth as a person throughout your career?
I think my writing helped me express, well, in journalism, it was learning so much that I didn't know about before. I mean, that's what was so great about journalism. I was on the scene, but not part of the scene. That was a very big thing for me. In fiction writing, it was learning so much and being creative about the characters and the setting and the events of the stories and the stories themselves and how the people interacted. And I could sit back and see these people and how they were acting. That's why I wrote 6 books, because these people wouldn't let me go.
That thread was pretty strong.
Yes, it was.
It was working your intuitive pretty good.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you for spending time with me today. Your story is very intriguing.
Thank you.
Heartwarming for sure to hear, how you came to be and having a career that length of time. Those types of careers don't last this way anymore. It's much different era. Thank you so much for coming by, and we'll make sure that we get all those links that you mentioned there, and we'll get some copies of the book on there as well. And I appreciate you coming by. We'll stay in touch with you.
Okay, I have a website. It's atuscanseries.com, and all my Sondheim book is on it, but so are all my Tuscany books.
Okay.
So people want to look at that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Leave Your Mark today. Tune into our next episode of Leave Your Mark with Vince Cortese. Be blessed.
You just left your mark. Thanks for listening. Listen to more episodes on demand. Just click Leave Your Mark with Vince Cortese.